episode 6, and with a change of format this time. So I recorded a session earlier this week making 2 crash sounds from scratch, but it was just Ableton audio, no narration while I'm making them. And the reason I did that is because each sound took me almost 45 minutes. And even after all the editing and stuff, it would still be like a 35-minute video. So what I'm gonna do instead is play the Ableton session back, little snippets of it, and pre-record narration over it. I'll explain very succinctly what I did to create both of these crash sounds, but first I want to talk about making crashes broadly. There was a video recently that I'll put on screen about synthesizing crashes from scratch, using various, modal synthesis and all-pass filter techniques. And it's a really cool video, you should watch it. But needless to say, my techniques didn't really involve any of the things mentioned in that video. And moreover, I don't really have a set method for making crashes. It seems like every single time I try to make one, I have to reinvent the wheel. Crashes are probably some of the most difficult sounds to make from scratch, especially if you're working primarily with synthesis. And I should also mention that my goal isn't necessarily to make a 100% realistic crash cymbal. One, because that sounds really difficult, but also because I don't think that's what I need in my music. If I want a realistic crash cymbal, I can just get a crash sample. So you'll see that I'm going for something a bit more abstract, but that can still serve the same musical function that a typical crash sample does. This video is also going to take a lot more editing, and I'm not looking forward to that. So let's get started. First, I inspected a few crash samples from my library just to get some understanding of how they behave. And the first instrument I decided to work with was a rack I have talked about in previous videos called Zest. This is a meld device with various randomized parameters used for creating crackling rain, bubble, and noise textures. You can also see that I'm using a randomized corpus rack to add a ringing metallic quality to the sound. At this point in the process, I am attempting to make the part of the sound that will occupy the 10,000 Hz range and above. Hence the somewhat excessive use of high-pass filters. And for a sound like this, I will almost always use multiple instances of corpus for a more complex sound. A limiter is also important on a sound like this with so many random clicks and pops. I added a shifter device on its default shift mode to push more of the sound into those super high frequencies. The stuttering quality this mode gives is also a nice touch. Now I'm more or less just making minor tweaks to find a nice balance of texture, noise, and metallic ringing. Next I added a reverb to soften the whole sound, but I didn't want to take away from the metallic quality, so I made sure to keep the room size very low to create the impression of a plate reverb. I believe this is the first time OTT has made an appearance in one of these videos. It's a shame it took this long. Here I've moved the reverb device before OTT in the signal chain and cranked up the dry-wet. For the sake of committing to what I have done so far, I have flattened everything to audio, but that doesn't mean we are done. I go on to process this audio with spectral blur in order to soften those dramatic pops and crackles a bit more. Then, finally, it all gets flattened to audio, and that does it for the high-frequency content of our crash. Now comes time for us to create the sound that will become the more mid-frequency body of the sound. For this I used another randomized rack called Buzz, spelled B-Z-Z. This one is made with Operator and is used for creating white noise similar to TV static. Short aside, but you may be wondering why all my racks have kind of strange names. I was planning on making a short about this as well, but the reason is because these names can be typed with only the keys on the left side of the keyboard. This way I don't have to take my right hand off the mouse when I am searching for a specific device. I also include an @ symbol at the beginning to very quickly filter out anything else. So there's a little bonus workflow tip for you. Once I have a white noise sound I like, I use a bandpass filter to isolate it to the 1000 to 2000 Hz range. This is where a lot of the low-ish rumble of a crash lives. And I applied a bit of drive for good measure. Next, some experimentation with 3 separate instances of corpus. Just like before, I really want to emphasize the metallic quality of the crash. I didn't want things to drag on for too long, so I quickly committed to what I had made so far and flattened it to audio. Now it was time to listen to both the sounds together and balance their respective levels. After a lot of trial and error, I have found that this EQ curve that you see on screen is a fairly reliable way to shape the frequency response of just about any sound to mimic that of a crash cymbal. You can even see the two distinct parts, the high material above 5K and the more mid-range body, just like we have been making. And now we have reached the part that a lot of you were probably expecting, when I begin shaping the decay of the sound using fades on the audio clips. This was a bit of a time sink. I really want to mimic that quality acoustic crash cymbals have that drummers call bloom. This is essentially the way a cymbal seems to reveal its highest and lowest frequencies over the course of the first 1500 milliseconds or so after it is hit. But it is a bit more complicated than that. Like I said at the beginning, crashes are very complex, and this quality about them is the part that is the most challenging to replicate. Here I attempted to automate the cutoff of both a low-pass and a high-pass filter to create that bloom effect. This is a technique I've had some success with in the past, but to be honest, here it's only kind of working. This is usually the point at which my process devolves into trying out basically whatever. In this case, I really wanted to create that sense of impact that a crash has right when the stick hits it. I grabbed another instance of buzz, quickly settled on some noise I wanted to use, high-passed it, and automated the volume to create a short burst of noise that decays very quickly. You may also be noticing that annoying click at the beginning of the sound. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but I think it has something to do with the filters I use to create the bloom effect. I think maybe there's a bit of latency between the automation and the actual movement of the filters. I wasn't terribly concerned about it though, because I knew I could just edit it out in the final bounce of the sample. Here I experimented with drum bus to shape the transient. I was getting closer to what I wanted, but wasn't quite getting there, so I resampled everything, edited the sound a bit, and then did something a bit out of character. I reached for a preset in the Designer Drums Ableton Pack, which is a collection of operator racks for drum synthesis, which includes crashes. These sounds aren't particularly great on their own, but I thought one of them could make a nice layer for more air in the sound. I experimented with a bit more reverb on the sound, and this is when I realized that a small room size along with a high diffusion amount makes an especially metallic sound. I played around with the Designer Drums rack a lot more after this, and eventually stumbled into something that was exactly what I was looking for. Then it was just a matter of elongating the sound. This is what really helped that bloom effect pop. With a bit more reverb experimentation, I got something really exceptional. And I made sure to flatten it to audio as soon as I could. When both this sound and the previous one were layered together, it had this beautiful combination of texture and space. So I bussed both of them together and sent them through another plate reverb, as well as another instance of Corpus set to its plate setting. More EQing and transient shaping to taste. Now I'm just playing with volume automation to get the whole shape right, as well as experimenting with different time stretching algorithms in the timeline. Another instance of Corpus can't hurt, right? A limiter at the end of the chain and the sound is just about done. Now I just gotta bounce the whole thing and ever so slightly tweak the shape with some volume automation. And that is crash number 1. For Crash 2, I wanted to see what I could do with some of the audio I have collected with my handy recorder. I eventually settled on this sound I made by dragging a heavily rosined violin bow across my plastic blender. I chucked it into a sampler device, looped a particularly noisy section, and used one of the LFOs to randomize the loop length. I high-passed the sound aggressively and then added a shifter device for more of that stuttering texture, and just to bring the sound higher in the frequency spectrum. But I also made sure to modulate the pitch gently with the in-device LFO for a bit of added movement and stereo width. 3 Corpus devices right off the bat this time. We all knew it was going to happen, so there's no point in putting it off for later. This time I made sure to bounce the audio as soon as I could. For the lower part of the sound, I'm using my random siren generating rack. I wanted something that had a lot of motion, as I knew I was going to be mangling it with effects beyond recognition anyway. And just like before, I'm using a bandpass filter to isolate it to those high mids. This is a rack I haven't mentioned yet, but I get a lot of use out of. I think about it as a kind of noisification rack that turns just about anything into white noise. It is essentially a randomized combination of vocoder, a fuzz pedal, and erosion. More corpus. And another. And another bandpass filter, this time with some motion. Now I'm processing both the sounds together with that crash-shaped EQ curve, and, you'll never guess, another corpus. And by another corpus, I actually mean two corpuses. It had occurred to me that in the previous sound, I didn't do much to create a sense of the sound being wide, so I went back to that first high section of the sound and added an autopan for more stereo width. I had remembered one thing from Zion James' video about synthesizing crashes, and it was that as a crash gets louder, it also gets brighter, and a great way to accomplish this is with distortion, so I added a saturator. I also added an erosion at the very beginning of the signal chain. There were a couple other minor tweaks, but I'll skip ahead to the part where I bounced the sound and shaped the audio with fades. I used a similar bloom technique as I did in the last sound, but this time I was a lot more careful to make sure the effect was subtle. Also similar to last time, I created a white noise burst with operator to emphasize that initial strike of the cymbal. This, in combination with a subtle fade at the beginning of the initial sound, made for a convincing bloom, but the whole thing was sounding a bit more like a noisy ride than a crash. A bit of saturation helped, but we still have some ways to go. I still wasn't getting that dramatic strike I wanted at the attack of the sound, so I created a noisy FM percussion sound with operator. I also shaped the timbre of everything together with more EQing and saturation. Finally, by boosting some of those mids dynamically at the beginning of the sound, I was able to give the crash a lot more body. Now it was starting to sound a lot more like a crash and not a ride. The sound was pretty much done at this point. The only minor tweaks I made after this were some transient shaping and limiting at the end of my chain. I bounced the sound, but there was still one thing that was bothering me. The whole thing was just a little too typical. It needed a bit of flair and drama. So, the very last thing I did before saving it to my collection was splitting the sound into 3 frequency bands and shaping the volume of the highest band with autopan and redux in order to create this glitchy stutter texture. And finally, we were done. Here is the final sound. So again, as you can tell, my process is very haphazard. I know broadly what shape I'm going for and kind of what frequency ranges I want to emphasize, and even a few techniques on how to make things sound metallic and ringy, but there's a lot I'm kind of just inventing on the spot. Some of the next few videos I'm going to be making are also cymbals, so hi-hats and rides are going to be the next 2 videos. With those ones I'll probably go back to the older format, just because they're slightly less complicated, but of course they have their own idiosyncrasies and quirks. But more than anything, I just hope you found this helpful.